Great to see you again. Thanks for joining
Good,
us.
thanks. Good to see you as well.
After the Ukraine war, DPRK became much closer to Russia, like making an arms deal. Handling those threats is even more complicated issue for the US. Do you see the difference between Harris and Trump on this issue?
Both Harris and Trump would see complications with a Russia DPRK connection. I think they both understand those threats. I think how they would respond may be different. I think the Harris campaign has a much more visceral reaction to Putin and Russia, and I think they would emphasize that connection with other allies and partners to try to put a stop to any kind of flow of materials, supplies going from Russia to North Korea, and of course from North Korea to Russia as well too. The Trump administration, I think they would be concerned about it, but because of President Trump's own um, views about Russia and perhaps Putin, he may not want to press so hard against Russia. But yeah, I feel like he may not come down as hard as maybe the Harris campaign would.
Okay. With Russia on its back, DPRK is making an advancement of nuclear weapons. If Ukraine war continues for a while, how can the US control DPRK's nuclear?
The United States has already had trouble managing, much less containing or controlling North Korea's nuclear program to begin with. So I don't think they're going to be able to control it. But what I think they'll focus on is really the flow of funding. I think they're going to try to strengthen the sanctions regime. They're going to, again, try to press allies, partners, the international community to help monitor sanctions, maybe try to rebuild some kind of coalition or mechanism that replaces the panel of experts at the United Nations that Russia, of course, disbanded by not agreeing to continue that approach. And also, I think there's been recently in the last year or two a focus on cyber crimes, on cyber hacking, again, because all of that is supposedly funding North Korea's weapons program. So I think that's where the emphasis will be just because the U.S. in some ways is very limited in what they can actually do to
Mm.
uh, prevent or control North Korea's program. And of course, there's been a lot of focus on defense and deterrence, but strengthening the U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral, strengthening alliances, conducting joint military exercises with South Korea, that isn't really deterring North Korea from moving forward in its nuclear program. So I do think I think cutting the funding flows, especially with Russia connected to North Korea these days, I think that's where the emphasis will be.
As long as Russia gets DPRK's weapon aid, Russia will not give up this war. I mean, is there a way for the US, I mean, the next administration, to stop the war?
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct. Russia is not going to give up. Putin has too much at stake.
Mhm.
He's not going to quit. Of course, the United States could cut all funding to Ukraine, and that would really um, put that would really tie President Zelensky's hands, and it would probably force him to negotiate some kind of settlement over time. Of course, Zelensky doesn't want to give up either as well. But if casualties start amassing, if public opinion in Ukraine begins to shift, where there's more demands to end the war, that may force Zelensky's hand. I'm not saying that the U.S. will cut aid, of course, but that's the Trump. If Trump wins, like that might be one approach. But really, I think the cutting the funding to Ukraine is one way that would really try to force a settlement. And frankly, I think either Harris or Trump, they would have to look at that approach and maybe persuade Zelensky that your best outcome to avoid any further killing or any possible further loss of territory may be to have some kind of negotiation with Putin. And the borders may not look the same as it did pre Russia invasion back in 2014. But that's something that I think the Ukrainians will have to decide for themselves. We, of course, can't force them to do it, but that might be one way of maybe pushing the war to an end by reducing funding.
Will friendship between DPRK and Russia continue after the war?
Yes, I think they'll continue to have a relationship, it probably won't be as robust as what it is during the wartime because, of course, what Russia needs most is munitions, rockets, artillery, which North Korea can provide. I don't think there's much to gain for Russia materially for maintaining relations with North Korea, but of course they could still receive political and diplomatic support. And I think for Russia, it's more of an idea of trying to perhaps build a coalition of other countries, maybe authoritarian countries. That might be one reason for Putin to continue his relationship with Kim. But I'm telling you, for even Putin, there's a risk to that as well too. The North Koreans will try to get whatever they can from the Russians, and at some point, the North Koreans may say we're too dependent on Russia, and they may look to some other country, or they may go back to China. But yeah, I do expect that relationship to continue even if the war in Ukraine ends.
In terms of the great power competition, it is China that brings tensions to the Indo-Pacific region. Do you see any chance for the next administration to try to be good with China?
Both Trump and Harris see China as the long-term pacing challenge. So there's actually more similarities between the two campaigns right now on China than probably differences. Harris right now, her rhetoric is very aggressive. It's very hawkish. I think she doesn't want to be seen as soft, being soft on China. So she's using pretty tough language. But if we observe what Biden has been doing since last November, he's trying to manage the U.S.-China relationship. He's trying to put a floor in terms of um, how contentious the U.S.-China relationship may fall. And I think Harris will also try to manage that relationship so it doesn't descend into some kind of conflict. But it's clear that she sees China as a competitor, if not an adversary. So I don't. It's hard to say that they would make good with China, but I think she would try to manage the relationship. For the Trump campaign and a future Trump administration, they've argued that they need to win against China. So China needs to be defeated. When you talk in those zero-sum terms, I think it's hard to say that you also want to make good with China. Now, we don't know. Trump may say nice things about Xi Jinping, and that may help manage the relationship. But in terms of trying to have a good relationship with China, I think that'd be difficult for both administrations. I think what a better way of looking at it is that they'll compete with China, but in a way that doesn't descend the U.S.-China relationship into an all-out war.
Then do you see a strategy like decoupling either for Harris or Trump can be effective way for dealing with China?
If you define what you mean by national security and you limit where your export controls or your tariffs are going to be, I think it can be effective because certainly I think there is advanced technology that China could use that could really it could really help China, especially on its military front, to really progress forward and then maybe pressure or even threaten the United States. So I think the U.S. has to be very careful and limit those sorts of ties that would give China a real competitive advantage, especially on the military front. I think again, if you define that narrow enough, I think that could be effective. But if you're going to make blanket statements and say you're just going to automatically put 60% tariffs or 10% tariffs more on all goods to China, that doesn't really make sense. And ultimately, the U.S. consumers are going to feel the costs as well too. There's concerns about inflation. Tariffs are going to make the costs of consumer goods go up as well too. So those are things I think the administration needs to balance when they think about an effective China strategy.
China hates to become a part of the Indo-Pacific order made by the US. Then how can we make China engage more within this region?
I think in terms of constructive engagement, something that the Biden administration had done since last summer is really to have these high-level dialogues or officials meeting regularly with Chinese counterparts. I think that would be a start, at least, so that there's more transparency and a better understanding of where both sides are coming from. There's obviously limits to that. Even if you engage with your counterparts, there's just some areas where China and the U.S. will see an issue, whether it's about the environment, whether it's about crises like in the Middle East or in the Ukraine, or even about things like the South China Sea, which is very contentious. They just have very different views. So I think you can only get so far. So I think the best way of looking at how we can make China engage more constructively um, is to really think about managing relations, and then finding those issue areas where we know that China has an interest, where the U.S. has an interest, and we know that it could help um, raise the bar for the region in terms of providing public goods. So development, I think, international development aid, development finance might be one areas where there could be some constructive engagement, perhaps in Southeast Asia. If you go to the Middle East, there is recently the U.S. struck back against Houthi rebels in the Red Sea because of piracy, and China also has an absolute interest in making sure that goods can flow in the Red Sea. So that's areas where we could be conversing with the Chinese, and we have a shared interest in bringing stability to a region. So it's those. I think that type of exercise would be useful in come January when the next administration thinks about how to engage China.
Well, since you said China doesn't like the bloc, do you think
Mhm.
China, I mean, President Xi wants to maintain a bromance with both DPRK and Russia?
No, I don't think you're absolutely right. He doesn't like bloc politics. If I mention China, Russia, North Korea, Iran bloc, they'll gently correct me that we don't like blocs. I do think that they have a shared interest in undermining perhaps U.S. influence or weakening U.S. influence, particularly in the Indo-Pacific
Mm.
region. So I think there's a shared common interest there, but I don't think they want to build some kind of coalition where China or Xi Jinping is the leader of this budding bromance among three autocratic rulers. I don't think that's really the way Xi wants to operate. So he'll coordinate, I think, to some extent because they're common interests with North Korea and Russia. But to build some kind of bloc or an alliance, I don't think that's really what Xi wants to do.
China has been ambivalent about DPRK for the last few decades. Perhaps China and Russia disagree on DPRK's nuclear. Do you see more role for China not to make DPRK a de facto nuclear state?
Yeah, I mean, China, of course, doesn't want North Korea to advance its nuclear
Mm.
program. It is still committed, I think, to North Korea denuclearization.
Mm.
And some even argue that the reason why North Korea hasn't conducted a seventh nuclear restraint is because of seventh nuclear test is because of Chinese pressure, the Chinese
Mm.
calling for restraint. But that being said, we know that China's preference, first and foremost, is stability on the Korean Peninsula. So if the nuclear weapons is what is providing stability for Kim, they can live with a nuclear North Korea. That's better than North Korea collapsing. So I think there's a limit into how far they might push the denuclearization, but uh, yeah, I personally I think there is more of a role for China to play. I think they could exercise their economic leverage,
Mm.
their economic ties to North Korea more effectively, um, to push North Korea not to go too far with its nuclear program. And China has an interest as well too. As North Korea becomes more of a threat, they'll just see further strengthening of a U.S., Japan, Korea, trilateral ties, U.S. South Korea alliance strengthening even further.
Mm.
China doesn't want to see that, so I do think that there is a greater role for China in bringing about more nuclear restraint on North Korea's part.
It looks like the US, the next administration probably puts DPRK off the list of its priority.
Yeah, the concern is that, I mean, the US, of course, cares deeply about the Indo Pacific region
Mm.
and even the Korean Peninsula. It's not that it's not a priority, but there's so many other problems happening around the world that North Korea falls below uh, falls below that list. But I think it's important for Korea to keep talking about the Korean Peninsula, keep talking about North Korea as a threat.
Mm.
In some ways, I'm wondering if this is why the Yoon administration also uh, points to things like the North Korea-Russia ties. Washington's biggest concern right now when it comes to North Korea is its ties to Russia. So I think for South Korea, I think they have to keep reminding Americans that this is all kind of linked. Do you think that a crisis on the Korean Peninsula is isolated? It's not. It's linked to, potential contingencies in Taiwan or even the Russia-Ukraine war. So I think that's one way of making sure that North Korea stays on the radar of not just the United States, but of the international community as well.
What would you suggest to your next president in the way of treating the great power like China and Russia?
Well, we are in an era of great power competition. I think we have to be concerned about great power politics and
Mhm.
how that's undermining global governance. How the U.S. and the West, they want to promote a liberal international order. They want to promote democracy and democratic values, but that's being undercut by China and Russia. So we have to take great power competition seriously. But what I would also tell the next administration is that you also have to pick and choose your battles. You can't try to push back Russia and China every time we say I think the U.S. also has limited resources as well too. So stay vigilant, take great power competition seriously, but also know uh, when to prioritize and where to prioritize the battles that you want to have with China and Russia.
Are you saying this to Harris or Trump? Both?
To both,
Okay.
of course.
And I think this is my last question. South Korea is in a tricky situation with a demand for a strategic choice between the US and China. What would you say about this?
That's a very good question. In the past, in South Korea, there's a saying where security is with the United States and the economy is with China.
Mm.
That language is, I mean, it should be changing though because of, I mean, it may not even be true because the number one export destination now for South Korea is the United States. And um, I would say that South Korea in some ways has made their position clear in that the alliance is the most fundamental thing, I think, to their foreign policy and national security strategy. China will always be important because it's such a large economy and large market. It's a neighbor. It borders the Korean Peninsula, so China will always be relevant. But that formulation in the past where security is with the United States, economy is for China, that's changing not because of US competition with China, but in part because China has changed. China is different from 10, 15 years ago.
Mm.
Korean companies are now competing with the Chinese companies in China's domestic market, and they're losing. China has basically caught up technologically, and Samsung, Hyundai, they can't compete as well, and so they have to shift or move their markets outside of China. Also, Chinese laws have changed. The national security laws make it much more risky to invest in China. They arbitrarily will just levy fines against foreign companies. So I think South Koreans need to think beyond China. And we've already seen we talked about de-risking, but South Korean firms moving to Southeast Asia, the United States, other parts of the world. So when it comes to the strategic choice between China and the United States, in some ways, the United States has become even more important. But I also think South Koreans recognize that you want to diversify your risk. And so if you think U.S. has become more important, but it's not just the U.S., it's the U.S. and this network of other like-minded countries and partners that I think the South Koreans can work with.
Mm. Okay, I think we're running out of time. This is all I have.
Sure,
감사합니다.
you're welcome.